Okay, now we're going to be talking about how this signal is transmitted through a neuron. But before we start talking about the signal conduction itself, first we should start talking about the resting potential. So let's zoom in maybe on this part of the membrane of a neuron. Here down. Okay, so first, what actually is resting potential? So the term resting potential refers to the fact that the inside of a cell is more electronegative than the outside. If you have some special tiny measuring device and you measured the electric potential in these two places, extracellularly, just above the membrane, and intracellularly, just below the membrane, you would find out that the voltage, the electric potential, is about minus 70 millivolts. In other words, that the inside of the cell is a little bit more negative than the outside of the cell. And this is really useful because this creates some electric gradient along which you can later on transport some stuff. But first we need to talk about what actually causes this electric gradient. And so there's this special pump called sodium potassium pump. That's the main culprit here. The sodium potassium pump sometimes is also called sodium potassium ATPase because it uses ATP in order to work. And how it works is this. The sodium potassium pump will transport the sodium ions from inside of the cell outside and the potassium ions from outside of the cell in. Now we know that outside of the cell the major ion is the sodium, and inside the cell the major cation is potassium. And so what the sodium potassium pump is actually doing, it's let's say separating the ions into its appropriate places, right? Sodium should be outside, potassium should be inside. And so what the sodium pump will do, it will take in 3 sodium ions, 1, 2, 3. Each has a positive charge. It will take these ions from the inside of the cell, and it will also take 2 potassium ions from the outside of the cell. And then the sodium potassium pump will use up the ATP, and it will turn, and it will look something like this. See, so what happened? The sodium potassium pump turned, and it led to the release of the sodium ions out and influx of the potassium ions inside the cell. And as I said, this does two things. First, it separates the sodium and potassium ions into its appropriate compartments. And second thing that happens, this also generates some of the charge, because if you look at it more closely, the sodium potassium pump takes 3 ions from the inside of the cell and pushes them out, but only 2 ions from the outside of the cell that it eventually pushes in. That means that you're eventually going to have some deficit of positive ions inside the cell. That would explain why it's more negative. However, this is only, even though this plays a role in generating this electric potential, sodium potassium pump is more important in generating that difference between concentration of sodium and potassium outside of the cell. What actually is generating much of that electric potential is the potassium channels that are spread throughout the membrane and allow the potassium to leak out of the cell. Okay, so actually what happens here at the potassium channel, you have high concentration of potassium inside the cell and pretty low concentration outside. So the potassium will be pushed out of the cell along its concentration gradient. And yes, it's true that the outside of the cell is more positive than the inside. And this will somewhat limit the ability of the potassium to go through the channel. But still, the differences in concentrations are so high that the potassium will leave the cell even against the electric gradient. Right? So, in order to revise, there are two things that play a role in the generation of resting potential. First is the sodium-potassium pump. It takes 3 sodium ions from inside the cell and it pushes them out. And it takes 2 potassium ions outside of the cell and pushes them in. The major impact of this is the generation of different concentrations of sodium and potassium, and it also generates some of that minus 70 millivolt electric potential on the membrane. Then what will increase the electric potential even more is the fact that along the membrane there are calcium channels spread around, and they will allow the potassium to leak outside of the cell. This leak would not happen without the action of the sodium-potassium pump, which generates the concentration gradient of the potassium, along which the potassium eventually spreads. Okay, and so these are the basic ideas or the basic mechanism behind the resting potential. And now we can build up on this and talk about how the signal actually is transferred throughout the cell.